commercial director here at Focus Integration.
Okay, so really what I wanted to do was just to preface what I'm about to talk about by sort of offering you 4 things you're going to take out of today. The first of which is the sort of latest disruptive thinking. We'll come on to that, I'm sure, throughout the session. The second is to give you some examples of retail tech that we're seeing that's driving experience. The third is hopefully to sort of give you some tools to act holistically and avoid what some may say is the sort of silver bullet trap, or the looking at shiny things first trap. And finally, hopefully a system that you can adopt today and take with you and use as a lens to test whatever it is that you're thinking about or looking at. So I wanted to start with just a little story. I think this might just help position me in this particular sort of subject matter. So it's the winter of 1991. It's probably one of the wettest winters that I can remember. I come out of my house after sort of being in business for about 9 to 12 months, getting nowhere very fast, being shown the door by most advertising agencies, and see this. And my choice is a ticket to Las Vegas or a new windscreen. And literally it was as stark as that. Well, there really was no choice. It was immediately the ticket to Las Vegas, and not for the reasons you might immediately think, not for the holiday or for the gambling or for the shows, but more particularly because I was in the process of launching what was to become a billion-dollar industry. Little did I know then, but the role for advertising within video games, very many years before Google started, and some thought somewhat crazy, but the journey that I was going to take would lead me to become a video game developer and rack up some 50 million video game sales and work for most of the well-known brands on the planet as this particular quirky idea took to the mainstream. Indeed, today, a video game is actually built pretty much first and foremost around the commercial input, and its content maybe sort of second, very much different from how it was considered in 1991. So my name is Daniel Bobroff. Today I work with Coded Futures, which is a creative technology business for fashion and retail, and powered by disruptors. And by that, what I mean is that we are in essence a scout. We scout the globe for disruptive, early stage in the main fashion and retail tech. And we use that sort of slightly different lens built around sort of our work in video games and the creation of experience-driven entertainment that is interactive, to foresee and hopefully advise some of our corporate clients on what is coming next. And one of the questions we are most often asked, and one of the questions I will talk about today, is this theme of omnichannel. You know, as in those early days in 1991, you know, it is important for you to be brave and for you to be single-minded in what you're going to do. And it's very, very easy for the doubters to sort of take hold. And certainly with omnichannel, with the degree to which that particular buzzword has become somewhat tarnished, and maybe even we don't even know how to spell as yet, it's somewhat easy to just sort of say, you know, isn't it just cross-channel being done well? You know, haven't we had that for years? Now, I would argue that that's to miss the point, because omnichannel really is the central force shaping the future of e-commerce and brick and mortar stores alike. And if e-commerce was retail disruption 1.0, then omnichannel is looking like it's going to be 2.0. And the reason for that, I think, is twofold. Firstly, it is very much the bridge between the physical and digital worlds, which is increasingly going to grow over time. But more importantly than that, we have seen the rise, and if you look at any major financial market, you'll see that the ones that sit very much at the top are those that are probably best defined as algorithm-based companies. At their core, they are developing code which is being used on the basis of a very large number of receptors, by which I mean the ability to capture data. And we know those companies, firstly as Google, but more increasingly across the spectrum. I mean, many of you will listen to your music on Spotify, watch your movies on Netflix, and the incredible thing about those companies that every single time you use them, they get better. It's a virtuous circle that has no end, so that they can now predict what sort of music you want to listen to and far beyond. And these algorithm-based companies have not only shown themselves to be the winners in this digital world that we are currently in, but also the ones that are fastest moving. So if you look at the retail sector, and if you consider that 90% of today's retail sales are still happening at the store level, how many receptors are there in that particular environment? How many data points does a retailer actually collect in his store? Well, before you answer, I think I'll give you the answer, and the answer is often one. How many people walk in and how many people walk out? And of course, that's simply not going to be enough in the future as the new consumer demands increasingly better experiences and wider choice. So omnichannel is not just that link between the physical and digital worlds, but it's also our ability to see the rise of what one might call the smart store. Will it be possible, and we believe it will, for a store to get better every time a customer enters, just as in the same way as a Netflix or a Spotify does? And that, I think, is at the essence of omnichannel. So today, our thesis is that every retailer is, to some degree, a technology company. So to look at the question of customer experience, one must first grapple with what that means to be a technology company. We know that, for example, customers see an implicit deal in the data that they are going to be asked to hand over. They see it as valuable. And whilst they will inevitably click the button on your screen that says accept cookies, they do expect something in return. And that's either experience or a fantastic level of service or a degree increasingly of personalization. But that exchange is increasingly growing over time. And if you need to take away 2 screens from today's webinar that you should use in your minds to think about how fast things can go, just use the following 2. The reason I was shown the door by many advertising agencies in 1991 about the idea of advertising in a video game was because it looked like this. But within 10 years, not only had that industry overtaken pretty much every other form of entertainment, whether it be music, whether it be cinema, whether it be TV, more people played video games for more hours than anything else. And advertising was absolutely an essential part of it because it looked like this. The degree with which Moore's law had affected that rate of change was staggering and took many by surprise, indeed saw the end of many. One of the key factors for this is the rise of 3D, and I think we are on the verge of seeing that within the retail space. So I was able to go off and have a few years in the sun and enjoy my the fruits of my labor. But coming back in 2012-13, I met up with my old media planning buddy who'd built an incredible business called ASOS. It was Nick Robertson. And what Nick demonstrated so brilliantly at that time was something that Clayton Christensen calls the innovator's dilemma. Nick was worried about, and in his words, the next monster coming over the hill. And Clayton Christensen, in his incredible book called The Innovator's Dilemma, talks about how disruptive innovation often takes root at the bottom of a market and relentlessly moves to the top, taking out all in its way. Well, certainly ASOS had done that to a large degree and was continuing to do that, but Nick was smart enough to know that now he might be in the sights of others who were seeing things in a slightly different lens. So he sent me the task of actually finding out what was that disruption, and what we found was really quite staggering, in fact, because we found disruption taking place across the entire value chain of fashion. ASOS Ventures was the vehicle that we used, but essentially what we were looking to do was build a magnet that would attract that talent, as we saw it, to ASOS before anyone else, and that would allow us both to be informed about things that were coming down the path, but also to improve our offer to customers. And that ecosystem is something that I fell in love with, because I'm still doing it to this day, and became a passion of mine, because I think I saw fashion and entertainment as bedfellows, and I think I saw fashion as the forerunner for retail in terms of how it would increasingly use technology to power experience over efficiency. And that ecosystem, as I said, covered every possible area of the value chain. It was, to this point in time, some 3,000 companies that we have scouted and spoken to and interviewed. And many of them have incredible business models driven by incredible teams. And so in many ways, if you were asked to describe business today, many would say that we live in an age of disruption. And I think it doesn't take too long, by looking at this particular advert from the mid-1980s for Radio Shack, to see that every single item on this page that was sold as a sort of plastic box for, you know, a large amount of money is now available in your pocket on one of these devices, the smartphone. But that particular disruption has led to the demise of Radio Shack, but equally to many of those products that we previously bought. Some would argue that digital disruption has sort of already happened, that you know, companies like Uber show that the largest taxi company doesn't actually need any taxis, or the largest accommodation provider like Airbnb has no real estate, or media companies like Facebook own no content, you know, and so the list goes on. So if we're no longer in an era of disruption, perhaps we've moved to a next phase, which is an era of mega disruption. And mega in the sense that now whole industries are being redefined. You know, we picked on a couple just now: the transportation industry, the hotel business, and mega also in the sense that this is now a playground that's open and accessible to all. Technologies abound; they have reduced enormously in cost. Power is incredible. I mean, the smartphone in your pocket is the equivalent to, you know, something that took several rooms, probably within a couple of generations ago, and a connected from birth generation who has a new way of thinking, who has a new way of approaching this language, in a sense. So if you're going to take away anything as an organization, what you need to do is think in an open capacity. Thinking about enterprise software in a closed loop now is no longer sufficient, because you will be surrounded by an ecosystem that is going to power this innovation, and collaborating with you is probably the best chance you have, because to try to envision every possible development across your business is simply impossible. So the other area I think that's worth just dwelling on for a moment in terms of the sort of changing nature of customer experience is what I've defined as sort of early stage heroes. These are the early stage entrepreneurs who are looking at doing things in a different way. And I think that many of their themes that come out time and time again in the conversations that I have are now being adopted by large corporates, because they're seeing that this is the better way to approach technology from the get-go. First thing is that they are experts in the sort of 4 core skills, and those 4 core skills today would be personalize, customize, digitize, and socialize. You know, they understand this. It's almost in their DNA when you speak to them. It's not something that comes as any sort of shock. And just in the same way as ASOS grew on the wave of a social media revolution, now personalization and customization is equally, these entrepreneurs are equally at ease with it. The next one might sound sort of somewhat obvious, but it's super important. Making something that people want is not equal to solving a problem. Solving a problem is simply that, but it's of no use if nobody wants it. And making something that people want, this next generation of entrepreneurs, they don't assume that they can immediately target that. They work towards it. I mean, even, you know, from the best known examples like Instagram, which start off as a completely different animal, and they happen somehow to find that along their journey. Making something that people want is a moving target, and therefore something that you need to assess as you go along by means of actionable metrics, by means of testing and learning. The other thing that we find very often is that the customer is very much at the core of what they do. They love their customers. Often they are their own customers. They have the customer interest at the front of everything they do. It's not sort of an afterthought. Equally, they have teams that are cross-collaborative. They work in multiple disciplines. They have done away with the use of silos. They work together. So the marketing guy sits next to the tech guy, sits next to the logistics guy, and so on, the customer service guy, and they work as a unit, not looking at each individual silo. They're experts at avoiding feature creep. You know, it's ever so easy when you come up with that next brilliant idea to make it so complex that by the time you're sort of faced with actually developing that, you're left with a sort of a 2-year plan. No, they look instead for the minimum viable product, and they focus on that, and then they build around it. And there's no better than Steve Jobs, who was certainly a hero to people like me, to sort of put that in the best possible way, which is to say that when you try to solve a problem of customer experience, the solutions you come up with are very complex, and most people will stop there and try to build those out. But actually, that's the time when you need to keep going and peel off the layers of the onion, because that's when you'll find the elegant solution, and it's the elegant solution that is going to win. Equally, these teams have a almost sort of unfathomable understanding of pivoting or persevering. You know, they are ready to change on a dime. Maybe that's because they're small and they can, and of course larger corporates are a little bit akin to oil tankers. It's very difficult for them to pivot. But that ability to pivot or persevere in many of the new thinking that you will bring to the table is vital. You know, often you'll hear the term fail fast. It really is pivoting or persevering that is the question that you should ask yourself. And in failing fast, it's that idea of dream, build, repeat. It's that idea that you won't get to version 3 without going from version 1 to version 2. And you can expect version 1 to, as the Americans would say, suck. But version 1 will be the gate through which you achieve version 3. And version 3, you hope, will change the world. So in that context, one of the areas that really must be looked at in terms of redefining customer experience at the store level and online is the idea of understanding new business models, because these technology and ideas don't live in isolation. And a couple of examples I wanted to share with you today, which I think are quite sort of inspirational. The first one is Rachel Sheckman, who thinks about the physical world 2.0. She sort of says, you know, if you're the same person online as you are offline, then, and you're changing because of that online experience, well, what are your expectations now within a store as a result? So Story is an example of that, where they change every 4 to 8 weeks, like a gallery. They still sell things like a store, but they take the point of view of a magazine. And what Rachel is interested in doing is using a physical space as a storytelling medium and bringing those two online and offline worlds together. At the same time, a huge organization now, Bonobos, who started off in 2007 with a simple vision, that of getting trousers that fit. You know, how difficult was that to find a pair of trousers that fit? That was their first thought. And around that thought, their first store was to be an internet-only store. But in 2007, that sounded crazy. So in terms of doubters, they certainly had their fair share. You know, why on earth would you create a store with nothing to sell? But of course, there was huge amounts to sell. It was just delivered through their online catalog. And that was at the heart of the endless aisle idea, which many retailers are beginning to explore today. But of course, Bonobos have had many years of practice at that already. And so they've emerged that idea through to a sort of an incredible customer experience, which is based around the idea of a guide shop. The idea that you now walk into this store, receive the kind of attention that you would have received in a sort of top of the market store of, say, the 1940s and 50s, you know, with a sales assistant who they don't consider a sales assistant, but a guide who will walk you through their assortment and collect data around your size. So in terms of that discussion earlier on around how many data points are they collecting, well, one of the biggest problems for online fashion is, of course, returns. But if you have the ability to measure your customer in one of your guide stores, you can be pretty sure that you're going to have a lower than average returns rate. The other one that I particularly like is Katia Beauchamp at Birchbox, who, you know, have developed a $100 million plus business around the idea of selling a subscription box of makeup samples. I completely identify with her, because as much as my original idea of advertising within video games was poo-pooed and laughed at, so too was this idea, because it was considered to be nothing more than a marketing concept. You know, the cosmetics industry is particularly traditional and didn't really take too well to this idea to begin with. In fact, didn't think it had any legs at all. But of course, what Birchbox was able to do was enter into this idea of personalized beauty and engage in a conversation with their customers that their customers absolutely were passionate about, which was beauty and beauty products. So using data from the get-go and using the ability to answer big data questions, they were able over time to create a highly personalized offer that has led to 30% of their customers buying full price product as a result of the samples. Initially, they were criticized that women just simply wouldn't provide information about themselves and their beauty product preferences. But that has proven to be so wrong, because in fact now Birchbox's challenge is to analyze unstructured data. So the structured data was a sort of questionnaire they would ask you, to sort of see what you liked, what you didn't like, what your skin color was, what your preferences were. Now they're being offered information by their customers that they're having to analyze, which is of course unstructured data, but has a wealth of information. So that ability to ignore, if you like, the doubters and stay focused on your vision and stay focused on your customer experience right the way through that journey that you will inevitably take is really what unites all three of these. And of course, the other thing that unites all three of them is their ability to be a storyteller. Recently, I've seen this suggested in a different sense, that we're now moving from a phase of being storytellers to being story livers. I think essentially it's the same idea. Retailers were always great storytellers from the start, and somewhere, somehow along the way, we've lost that magic. And it's important that we get that magic back, and the use of technology to tell those stories is absolutely at its core. Because of course this is an interactive story now. It's a story with the customer as its star, just as in Birchbox asking customers to tell them about their beauty preferences. By engaging in that kind of dialogue on a one-to-one personalized basis, you think of it almost as empowerment, really. You think of turning your customer into a star and having a two-way conversation with them powered by technology. And one of the interesting initiatives I've seen recently is that by eBay, with a small Israeli startup who came out of the securities industry. I mean, they developed a technology that allowed for you to hunt the bad guy in a video, basically, because I guess in Israel they are often looking for bad guys in videos. Nevertheless, that technology could also be used to hunt the product in a video. And of course, what eBay have sought to do is to use that particular aspect to unite the kind of product offerings on eBay with an on-the-fly delivery of user-generated video reviews from YouTube and beyond. And of course, it's compelling stuff, because now all of a sudden you look at a product and you see actually what somebody who has it thinks of it. Storytelling today isn't about chapters. It's not about a long period of time. It's actually about moments. It's actually about sort of tapping into your customers sort of 100, 200 times that they look at their mobile phone, and actually being part of that moment, whether they want to go somewhere, do something, feel something, or buy something. You need to be present. And in those sort of moments, one very good example was BuzzFeed's golden white dress. What you see sort of animating somewhat chunkily, I would imagine, since we're on a webinar, is a real-time, it's a sort of stop frame animation of the hits to the BuzzFeed website at the launch of this particular story. I'm sure you remember it. Was it gold and white or black and blue? It became an internet sensation. It became a viral hit. It led to BuzzFeed's traffic record being smashed to pieces, and ultimately 670,000 active visitors reading about this story, and 50 million plus views across pretty much every country in the world. And the reason this is an interesting story is because this was one of the first times that BuzzFeed has decided to not insist upon the sort of vagaries of its own business model and force everyone to BuzzFeed to see any type of content, but actually to distribute that content wherever and whenever their customers were. So that meant all the social channels, that meant Facebook, that meant Twitter, that meant any possible channel that they felt was relevant to that story. And of course, that release, if you like, of the vagaries of the BuzzFeed business model prior to that date resulted in this huge viewership and involvement. So it's a conversation that you are engaged with across many, many channels. And if you think that the act of purchase previously you could be thought of as a funnel, today you might want to think of it more like a journey. And being part of your customer's journey in a sort of collaborative manner is exactly the sort of new rules of the game. So identifying your brand story and understanding how your customer can participate is at the core of this, and it's the technology that powers that rather than the shiny thing that you wave in front of them and say, aren't I clever? I think it's important to talk a little bit about the sort of most social generation of all time, the sort of millennial and increasingly the Gen Z. And I think it's important to talk about them because their behavior has become addictive for other generations. I think we're all sort of following them as bellwethers in many senses. They'll soon represent one of the most significant purchase power bases of all generations, sort of spending somewhere in the region of 250 billion next year and 17 trillion in their lifetime. But of course, this particular generation, we talk about sort of having been connected from birth, did have a very different childhood to the Gen X's and baby boomers that preceded them, that, you know, I'm one of, but I seem to have spent my entire life making content for the millennial, but nevertheless, this was my sort of early youth. Go to the park and get on your bike. But sort of gradually over time, sort of fear of urbanization, traffic, you know, parents who had greater sort of levels of sort of neurosis, one might say, led to, you know, training this generation on mobile devices, small screens. This was the first one, it was the Game Boy. But, you know, over time, this particular generation has grown up connected to their glass, connected to their screens. And, you know, now they see themselves in a very different sense to previous generation, because technology has democratized an opportunity for many young people that, with access to tools, information, and ultimately a voice, they've been able to do things with it that previously were only sort of the domain of the most wealthy. Because the millennial now sees themselves as their own brand, and in many ways the companies and brands that we recognize are seen as their servants. A good example of that would be sort of Kim Kardashian, who for many sort of non-millennials sort of represents everything that's wrong with her generation. But, you know, and equally she readily admits that she has no particular talent, but she also has an understanding of why she appeals to the extent of 100 million Instagram followers of late, and why she appeals to her peers. And to quote her, she says, "They like that I share a lot of myself and that I've always been honest about the way I've lived my life." So that kind of honesty and authenticity is at the core of the millennial and driven by the technology that has given them this voice. Of course, it's very easy to misunderstand them as well. And in 2013, Time magazine described them as lazy, entitled narcissists who still live with their parents, talking about how, you know, 40% of them believe they should be promoted every 2 years regardless of performance. I feel that that's, you know, to completely miss the point, because this me generation, as Time magazine described, isn't actually a me generation. It's a we generation. Because if you look back at previous generations, if you think that the baby boomers of the 60s were the sort of liberated generation, you know, sort of flower power and the like, and the Gen X's, you know, were the sort of competitive generation, millennials in many senses are the global generation. And one of the things that they use technology for is the ability to share. You know, we might say we're in a sharing revolution. But at the same time, this is a very visual generation. And so one tremendous example of how they share but also see themselves as brands is the pouting selfie, which, you know, led to the word selfie being added to the dictionary in 2013. But the concept has gone beyond that to the extreme selfie, where literally millennials will put their lives at risk in the desire to achieve the currency that they recognize, which is likes, shares, comments. And these are the sort of currencies that brands must increasingly understand and master. To take that a stage further, you begin to see the sort of disintegration of the traditional media world through the rise and incessant rise as Clayton Christensen talks about with that innovator's dilemma of the influencer. Zoella in the UK is probably our best known example, with probably over 10 million now Instagram followers. You see the numbers in front of you. But these guys are interesting because they ultimately are customers, they're consumers who have become personalities, empowered by sort of digital tools and the web. They've become personalities who have amassed a significant following, and a number of brands are beginning to follow a similar sort of path, such as, say, Lululemon, who now have defined the term ambassador as being their sort of interest in becoming involved with community, and they see marketing now as community rather than marketing, and they invest heavily in personal development programs. They seek out ambassadors amongst the customers that use their products, and they spend their money there rather than trying to go for sort of the traditional superstars that we all know. Another company that's a tremendous interest in this particular space is Brandbassador, where they are looking at developing automated influencer marketing, which of course is 60% up year on year for most retailers, to target sort of the micro influencer at scale, because traditionally retailers now target influencers, they'll go for a dozen or so, but really, would it be better to go for a dozen or so to get that viral hit, or a couple of thousand? You need technology to help you do that. So the takeaway here is empowering your customer gives you access to other data, other receptors, and those other receptors is what's going to power your algorithms and ultimately turn you into one of those algorithm leading companies in the retail space, as much as others have done it in other spaces. Of course, mobile is the key game in town, and being mobile first, I think, is the other aspect in terms of customer experience. Indeed, I heard just yesterday that a large organization is now coining the phrase internally with its team, no mobile, no meeting. In other words, if you haven't got a mobile first strategy to what you want to talk about, we don't want to talk about it. And the reason for mobile first, and also the example again of millennials as the brand, is sort of illustrated in this particular screen. 80%, 87% of millennials say that their smartphone never leaves their side. And indeed, what's so interesting about this particular image of the recent elections is, of course, that it's about me rather than the politician, and each of them wants to be in the photo, apart from the one middle-aged guy that you can possibly see if you look carefully, and he's acting in the traditional sense. ASOS came out with its numbers. Now these are already 6 months out of date, but half of all of its orders were placed on mobile platforms, more than 60% of all traffic coming from smartphones. I mean, that half of all orders placed on mobile platforms, if you go to Asia, that's near 80%. So, and there's really only one direction that we are heading with this. So, we are seeing the mobile device as being the all-powerful platform today. And of course, that means that you need to start to think about what the user experience is going to be on the mobile device, because how that currently looks, I would argue, is somewhat basic. Here is an example from a company called Grability, trialing with El Corte Inglés in the grocery sector, trying to look at the use of a tactile interface, the old idea of putting things in a basket. And it's, compelling, I'm sure you'll agree. But equally, as we said, we are now in a visual generation, and of course, use of technologies such as visual search can be enormously powerful, not just for fashion, as you see here, but for other sectors as well. There is a challenge, of course, in terms of adoption from the customer. In the case of fashion, it proved to be initially in the first instances where they thought about snapping someone on the street and then buying that particular product online, that ended up feeling a little creepy to the customer that was using it. But ultimately, that particular technology proved to be enormously powerful for tagging products, for the ability to manage inventory, for the ability to improve speed to market from inspiration to production. And of course, the next generation is going to be moving on to our ability to understand sentiment and a whole manner of other visual clues that surround us every day. And of course, those are other receptors that retailers must get expert at. The one that's been the talk of the town this year has, of course, been bots and the use of AI. And of course, here we're right at the very beginning as well, because if you've used one of these bots, in this particular case a shopping assistant, you'll come away thinking it's clunky. You'll come away thinking, it was a bit basic. It doesn't really do very much. But essentially, the retailers that are adopting this kind of technology understand that they are learning a language, and that language will take some investment and some time. They won't get straight to version 3 without going through version 1 and 2. And such as the very first video games I made, I look back on pretty crappy. The last ones I made, absolute genius. I had to go through that learning curve, and this is the same example. And of course, the other area that retailers are beginning to look at is other forms of input, other interfaces. And of course, Google Home and Amazon Alexa offer us an enticing glimpse to voice activation. I think you have to have the right accent for it to understand you, but nevertheless, we're on a journey to other forms of input apart from text. And what we know about millennials is they don't really write, and they don't really like words. They like emojis, and they like images, and they like shortcuts. So we need to get better at this kind of technology, and then we end up in a whole new space. So adopting a mobile first mantra is very much more than just, can I make my app better? It's a mantra that comes across all of your channels. And of course, it takes us into the next area, which is that of me-commerce. And me-commerce really is, again, at its very sort of earliest iterations, the idea of the market of one, the idea of personalizing the content. If I play a video game, it's very different, the experience, from if you play that same game. But if I go onto a website, it's exactly the same. If I open an app, it's exactly the same. And what Very were trying to do in this particular example is personalize the homepage. Well, we need to go way beyond personalizing the homepage. We need to personalize the entire experience. The closest to that right now, Amazon. But technologies such as 3D, which you see here in a company called Looklet, not just challenge traditional areas such as, say, the model, and what does the model of the future look like? Well, apparently she looks like this. But equally, it allows for the use of collections to be put in front of customers before they've even been made, and for a just-in-time production to be incorporated into retail. And personalization galore. I mean, you can now be served with models that look like you, or to which you respond to the best. You can customize outfits, you can build outfits. I mean, we see the very, very earliest examples of this in some of the magic mirrors, but in terms of a retail and an online experience, it is going to be possible to visualize aspects of yourself. I say that hesitantly because I think with fashion particularly, we always look to the aspiration of ourselves, the old adage of, does my bum look big in these? We don't always want to see ourselves, but in some instances, where we want to say, look at whether outfits work, we do want to see ourselves, and 3D is going to be a way by which that and other aspects are powered. And of course, the other element of personalization is going to also be pricing. In the case of Everlane, they've taken a sort of radical approach to this by disclosing every aspect of how much their product costs, and therefore how much they're charging you. And of course, they're tapping into that millennial desire for transparency. But the idea of personal pricing is even more interesting still. And of course, loyalty is the other element that I think you'll find to be disrupted extensively. In this particular example, Out for Food, for a group of Romanian restaurants of all things, what they've done with this particular loyalty initiative is to include elements of CSR, corporate social responsibility. So you can give away loyalty points to causes. Healthy living, in terms of if you undertake exercise, you earn more. If you reduce your fat content, and so on and so forth. And equally, gamification, which they are at the very beginnings of, but again, such as bots and voice-activated interfaces, gamification is also an early and new technology and language for retailers. And of course, customer service is at the heart of all of this, because if you're going to have an omnichannel proposition, that means that you need to look after the customer irrespective of the channel that he or she uses, and your terms, in terms of your speed, tone of voice and outcome, it should always be the same. And of course technology is going to be how you achieve that. As you look at bonobos and you think about guides, or you look at Lululemon, you think about their definition of the new shop assistant. We are talking here about the move from the sales assistant to the in-store influencer, and the customer support member is probably right at the coalface as far as this is concerned, because your customers live in a real-time context, and if you're going to interact with them, you have to do that in a real-time context too. And one example of that particular sort of challenge for personalization has been seen in the fashion industry with sizing, because it's been a problem for years, and returns is probably in the region of 30+% for most online retailers. Initially, they saw this, and I sort of touched on it earlier on in terms of the silver bullet trap. They saw it as a sort of silver bullet that they could just introduce onto their site, one of these sort of infuriating questionnaires, and expect that people would fill out it was almost as stupid at one point in terms of sort of go out there and measure an item of clothing that you have in your wardrobe. Nobody's going to do that. No millennial's going to do that. And of course, the response to that was tiny. What you want is magic. You want it to actually be predictive. You want it to be smart. You want it to know from all of the other information you've given to the retailer before that point what size is going to best fit me. And of course, there's a win-win there, because it's in the retailer's best interests to get that right. And of course, for TrueFit, probably the leading company in this space, what that's led to is a move towards understanding not just the aspect of fit, but more importantly, the aspect of style. And style is a far, far more interesting question, possibly, than fit, because from style, it informs a whole range of different experiences. And of course, style, if any of you have millennials in your household or are a millennial listening to this, you'll know that there's a hugely, depending on whether you prefer tight-fitting garments or loose-fitting garments, it's the other one is just the complete antithesis, and you'll never sort of accept it. And that is a style choice rather than a fit choice. In terms of that sort of personalization and me-commerce, if we take it to its extreme level, look at the work that Shoes of Prey are doing in terms of being able to service individual customized shoes with millions of permutations, from the size of the heel to the leather to the color to the shape, and really beginning to understand that question in an extremely effective way, so much so that the delivery time when I first came across these guys was somewhere in the region of 6 weeks, and today it's less than 1 week, and I'm sure tomorrow it'll be less than 1 day. That is the level of understanding that they've been able to gain to personalized, customized product. So the takeaway here is, if you let your customers identify themselves in every touch point that you have with them, you gain enormous opportunities to personalize, and that your challenge over the coming years will be how you use those opportunities to personalize. Of course, one word of warning is, of course, the uncanny valley here. There's just something slightly wrong about this animation. We can't quite put our finger on it, but it doesn't look right. And that uncanny valley is an area where you really need to think closely when you look at personalized, and maybe one of the reasons why we don't see too many examples of being bombarded with offers through beacons, because customers don't really like it. And also the example of the visual search initiative. Of course, the number one aspect in any survey for customers' wishes, and omnichannel in particular, is getting me the product on time. It's almost a never-ending increasing level of expectation for the customer. Best example here is Veruca Salt, who wanted her squirrel. Maybe that is the customer of today. So trained are they by the standards of Amazon that every other retailer really needs to play at the same sort of level or look or risk being left in the dust. And for that, you know, a good example here is to think about how your supply chain is no longer something that's in the background, but something that's very much front of house. You know, the funny thing here is how the postman managed to get up the stairs to deliver the card, but couldn't take the letter. And you know, those kind of things are very, very obvious to customers, and they reflect on the brand. So the ability to improve there by connecting elements of the supply chain, by having a flexible logistics strategy, by introducing technologies such as RFID, which allow for a far smoother, more efficient flow of data around the sort of physical and digital world. Stock flow in particular is going to be crucial in this next phase. Of course, it's a huge bet, but it's future-proofing the business. And one of the companies that's doing a lot of great work in that space is Ditego, who are looking at building sort of the middleware layer between the sort of use of RFID and the various systems that you have already in play. But equally, there are other very, very exciting initiatives, such as this one pioneered by Locals, which was the sort of last mile solution about how click and collect has been a huge success. And now, of course, the next iteration of that is the ability for the retailer to know that you're coming into the store before you actually get there. And they do that through the use of beacons and this particular smart technology. We move towards the future. This particular instance of Starship collaborating with Mercedes-Benz is particularly interesting, and they here are using robots to distribute around locations which are stored in these particular Mercedes-Benz vans. Whether we'll see that now or in the near future remains to be seen. So supply chains are a crucial part of the omnichannel presence and need to become more agile, and they are increasingly more visible to the customer. One next bit is, of course, the actual use of retail as an experience. And you know, it's worth looking at this particular image of the store in the 1920s or 1910s and a store most recently. You know, how little has changed. You know, the storekeeper still seems to stand behind a desk divided by a till, and the customer stands patiently queuing. And of course, technology is going to allow for us to make huge leaps in this, where retail is not going to be, you know, just the same as it's always been. It's going to increasingly be an experience. And looking at that particular level, Leroy Merlin, who introduced their sort of trial and workshop program, which has been enormously successul, and sort of taps into the idea that customers now want to be able to test the product before they buy it. So here they get that opportunity with you know, education along the way. And even that is extending to the creation of new shopping malls, such as the Al Maraya one in Abu Dhabi, which is a $1 billion investment in a new shopping mall that includes, you know, food and beverage, entertainment, technology at its core. So every aspect of the experience is digital as well as physical. And of course, you know, if they don't manage to get the physical space right, technologies such as VR offer a real alternative. The most social technology of all time, Mark Zuckerberg called it, and undoubtedly an experience-based technology that is going to radically reshape how we buy things and how we interact digitally. But there's also the opportunity for that to be a mixed reality, and companies like The Void, who are incorporating virtual reality into physical stores, at this moment in time, it's more around the idea of a sort of entertainment experience. These are definitely worth keeping an eye on, because you're going to start to see this kind of stuff appearing in a physical store. Gamification is what it's about. I probably don't have the time to tell you everything I want to tell you about gamification. It's just a huge area. But you know, think of gamification not just about buttons and badges, but about how game developers think about it. Something called cognitive flow. Here are some of the themes that go into what makes a hit game as opposed to something that's just okay. And Pokemon Go has been a tremendous example of that, something that ultimately grew from nowhere to have $500 million of revenue within literally 3 months. So retail is an experience. Make the technology invisible and gamify the interaction. All of this is great, but we live in an uncertain world, and that extreme uncertainty is probably best shown by this particular slide, which shows the degree of complexity that now exists in terms of the tech stack that most retailers are faced with. Where once it was important to maintain a rigid control over that tech, today with advanced and secure tools, those days are gone, and really now it's more about offering autonomy to let teams choose the technology that solves their problem best, building APIs, separating the UX from the data layer, and defining your leadership not just by patents, but how well you can attract and motivate the best engineers. And often that isn't within your organization. Often that is by working with companies who specialize in just that. And I'm not going to give you I am going to give you the advert for Focus, but I think there's a great example of a team that sort of has that kind of core competency. Because they don't see the engineer like this anymore. They sort of see them like the rock star that they are. And Google talks about the next battleground being not whether we can build something, but what we should build. So the sort of 5 key factors that you need to be looking at in terms of building that world-class software delivery capability are shown on this slide. And it's really more about building a culture that allows you to adapt and learn as much as it's about building those specific technical skills, because that is going to be something that you iterate over time and that you understand over time. But fundamentally, as Jack Welch says, there are still only 2 sources of competitive advantage: the ability to learn more about your customer faster than your competition, and the ability to take that learning and put it into action faster than the competition. So in that respect, creating a fast and flexible tech structure around a single view of data, whether that view of data is the customer data, the product data, the intent data, or the sales data, is absolutely at the core of making you equipped for this next phase of retail disruption. And that means a fight against waste, because waste is a killer in our business, and features are often waste if they're not thought through. And it also means going through that sort of build, measure, learn loop as fast as you possibly can, iterating at each stage, either pivoting or persevering with a particular view as you analyze the success of it against actionable metrics which you've identified up front. Because ultimately speed will kill, and it will kill your competition if you can get through that loop faster than somebody else. If you can build enough receptors, as others can do, to mean that every single time a customer walks into your store or uses your app, it gets better. You will be at the forefront. So fostering a culture that identifies and optimizes those engines of growth is going to be essential. And examples of how that's being done today, they are many, they are varied, they all have their strengths and weaknesses. Shop Direct, for example, have a lab. They take customers in there, they put everything in front of the customer, they watch. They started off a couple of years ago, I think they were able to do about 60, 70 tests a year, and they're now in excess of 500 tests a year. So, that speed of iteration is right at the core of a company that's defined its future by digital. And if you look at their numbers, they are, extremely impressive in terms of their success. And it's fundamentally because of the way they've been able to adopt this culture. In ASOS's case, it was really more about cool hunting. It was going out there finding that particular talent wherever it was. In Farfetch's case, and you may have noticed that they launched their OS yesterday, for them it's about building a platform. For them it's about collaboration. It's about being the pipe between the independent boutiques and the many, many talented early stage teams out there. Even more ambitious is Zalando, who define something called radical agility, where they give to each of their teams the decision-making capability about a new feature and ask for them to own that particular feature right the way through to delivery. So I promised you a system, and so here it is. It's an acronym, and I think if you just take a note of this, it will serve you well. It's certainly something I use, and it's something that you can immediately see whether an initiative is going to work or not. And so the first thing is to say that, you know, whatever it is you're going to build, it's got to be immediate, because patient levels, speed is such that whether it be how fast a page loads, how fast the app can be downloaded, how fast you can deliver a response, immediacy is absolutely crucial. It needs to be social because, of course, as we said, this is a generation that has a worldview, is connected 24/7 and looks for that kind of connectivity. It needs also to be personal because each and every single one of your customers is a brand, they're unique. And it needs to be fun because I'm not going to fill out your questionnaire online so that you can tell me what size I am. I want to do something that's fun. I want it to be worth my time, whether that be in a retail store or on your digital asset. And it has to be easy because my tolerance for things that are complicated and where there is huge amounts of friction is very, very low. And I will spend extremely limited amounts of time with you if you can't give me something that's easy. And finally, it needs to be discoverable because I need to be delighted. I need to find things that are different each time. I don't want to see the same thing over and over again. So if you put that together, it's I love speed. And I think that really could be the system by which you save yourself countless hours of heartache. So thank you very much indeed for your attention. I hope it's been useful, and welcome any questions you have.
Thank you very much, Daniel. If you've got any questions about the content that you've seen, please feel free to contact us. The contact details are there on the screen. You will receive a recording of the event as well, so you can watch it again or forward it to a colleague if necessary. But thank you again for attending.